On June 13th, 1980, the town of Wiley, Texas would be home to an incredibly brutal and violent crime. The killing of local resident Betty Gore would shock the community and leave them wondering how something like this could have ever happened in their town. Even crazier for them was that the killer was Candy Montgomery, a seemingly nice housewife who was a popular member of her community and church. So what possibly happened for these two to be involved in the most violent crime in the town's history? Well, let's just get right into it. Candace Wheeler, Candace is her real name, everyone calls her Candy, would be born on November 15th, 1949. She would eventually marry a man named Pat Montgomery. In 1977, they would move to Wiley, Texas. Her husband Pat worked as an electrical engineer for Texas Instrumentals, and they would make over $70,000 a year, which at the time was a lot. Candy then would be a stay-at-home mom to look after their two kids, which was a boy and a girl. Candy would also be an active member of the community, especially taking part in the church activities. People in her community would describe her as a very outgoing, likable person. She apparently would even teach Sunday school and sing in the choir for the church. It would be at this church where Candy would meet two other people who would become very important in this story, Alan and Betty Gore. Before we continue, let me just give you some quick information about these two because they are very important to this story. So this couple, Alan and Betty Gore, would be married in 1970 and eventually move into the area when their first child, named Elisa, was born. Betty would get a job teaching in an elementary school in Wiley, but she would soon grow to dislike this job. She would also struggle because she hated to be left alone when Alan would have to travel for his work. Despite all of this, in 1978, they decided to try to have another child together. This forced them to keep having to try for a child, which is something they hadn't done in a long time, and this would end up feeling almost like a chore for Alan, which these negative emotions about this relationship would definitely be a cause for something that he would end up doing soon. Him and Candy would start having an affair together. See, Candy wants something to make her life a bit more interesting, as she found just living the housewife life a bit boring. So when she thought about having an affair, she immediately thought of Alan, because they had always gotten along really well together. This affair would not immediately happen, and both of them would just consider the pros and cons of it for a while, but eventually they would just decide to do it. They would both agree that they did not want to get emotionally involved with each other, but as you'll see, that did not last very long. They would only meet on weekdays when their partners were at work, and they would always meet at a motel. This would often be the Como Motel, which was a super cheap motel that was in the area. Man, what happened in my life for me to be talking about two people's sex life on YouTube? What? Yeah, anyways, this affair would go on for a while. However, it would eventually stop when Betty would give birth to their second child, another girl named Bethany. This would get Alan and Betty to agree to try and get help for their marriage. So they would end up going to a program called Marriage Encounter, designed to help struggling marriages. Alan would then tell Candy he wanted to focus on his wife and kids, and the affair between them would officially be over. It was June 13th, 1980, when the horrific crime would take place. Now, there's some debate as to what actually happened next, but pretty much Candy would go over to the Gore's house. This was not uncommon, as they were good friends, and in fact Candy was looking after their eldest daughter this day. But Candy and Betty would end up getting into a fight. Candy herself would later claim that Betty had found out about the affair and tried to confront her about it. She said that Betty tried to attack her with an axe. No matter if that story is true or not, the ending of the story is the same. Candy got the axe from the Gore's house and beat Betty to death with it. Betty would be struck 41 times with the axe. The blows with the axe were all across her body, on her arms and legs. 28 of them would hit her head. The damage from this was so bad that Betty would be missing her right eye. Luckily, forensics experts concluded that she was unconscious during most of this. What makes this crime even worse is the seeming lack of care that Candy had about this. Candy herself later admitted that after she killed Betty, she took a shower in the Gore's house. This was confirmed by blood found on the bathroom wall and Candy's hair that was found in the shower. Candy then would just go on her day like nothing happened, and most messed up of all, she would even pick up the Gore's eldest daughter from church to look after her that night. The day all this took place, Alan was out of town on a business trip, so for a while he didn't think anything was wrong. This was until he tried to get into contact with Betty and got silence. He would try to get into contact again multiple times over and over before realizing that something must be wrong and calling his neighbors. He would tell his neighbors to get into the house by any means necessary. The neighbors would break into the house and find Betty's body along with the youngest child in her crib crying and dirty after being left alone for around 13 hours at this point. One of the neighbors would even say that he had initially thought Betty had been shot with a shotgun because of how badly her body was messed up. For 2 days, Candy would not even be on the suspect list. One of the most annoying things about this case to me is how the investigation and the trial were conducted. As you'll see, there will probably be a few things here that will get you a bit angry because of how poorly they were done. So to start off, when the crime scene investigator got there were already news teams, neighbors, and just other people showing up to form a crowd of people. The police hadn't really done a good job to make sure they didn't damage the crime scene. The police in this area were not used to crimes of this nature happening often, so they weren't properly prepared. The house didn't even have crime scene tape on it, they just had some fucking packing tape across the door. Also, when finding the murder weapon, an officer would just put small plastic bags over the handle in an effort to preserve evidence. The bags were also on the handles of the front and back doors. The crime scene investigator would say that this was a failed attempt at an inexperienced person to preserve evidence. However, the thing they messed up the most at the investigation was that when they went into the bathroom, the bath mat had bloody footprints on it. This obviously could be used for evidence. However, again, an inexperienced officer rolled up the mat, which ruined the evidence. Okay, but enough of what they messed up. What did they actually get from the investigation? Well, speaking of the bath, there was the blood on the walls and around the drain of the bath. Like I mentioned before, Candy had showered here after committing the crime, and her hair was found in the drain. Another important piece of evidence was that a $20 bill was found in the master bedroom, proving that this wasn't just some random robbery. The investigator was quoted as saying, "A good thief wouldn't have left anything like that." They found the axe with half its blade hidden under the freezer, and nearby they found a pair of sunglasses with a missing lens and one sandal, which was evidence that there was some sort of struggle. They also found slide marks and footprints indicating a body may have been moved. There was also a bloody fingerprint on the freezer. Luckily, the fingerprints and footprints were enough to get a warrant for the arrest of Candy Montgomery, and on June 27, 1980, she was arrested and charged with the murder of Betty Gore. She's arrested, and I'm the one to actually read her rights. Some female jailers strip searched her and take off all her clothes, and that's when they notice all these bruises and also a cut on her toe, said the former investigator. This case was going to go to trial. Candy was going to be represented by civil law attorney Don Crowder and defense attorney Robert Udashan. But with a case like this, you would probably be thinking that there's no defense that they could possibly have, but you would be wrong. Robert Udashan wanted them to get a psychiatric evaluation for Candy, so he would call a friend and got the name of a good psychiatrist with experience testifying in court. The name they would get would be Dr. Fred Faison. Now, Dr. Faison was a court-appointed psychiatrist who could assess whether defendants could stand trial. However, he also did something less common, which would be hypnosis. When meeting him, Candy would tell him the same self-defense story she had gone over with her lawyers. After which, Dr. Faison would decide to try and figure out where this rage that took over her came from. He would use hypnosis in an attempt to age regress her, to find out where in her life it may have come from. His conclusion is that it came from some childhood trauma that would have resurfaced when talking to Betty. In the trial, Candy would plead self-defense and say that Betty had attacked her following a confrontation about the affair, and that she used the same axe that Betty attacked her with. The cut on her toe would be proof that she was attacked by Betty. The prosecution would obviously argue against self-defense as, 41 hits with an axe is definitely overkill for that, and that Candy could have just simply fled the scene instead. In court, the defense would try to use the hypnosis as evidence, even though this is very unusual for a court case. They would say she went through a dissociative reaction, and that was the reason the crime was so violent. Dr. Faison would say that something Betty had done that day reminded her of the childhood trauma she went through and caused her to lash out like this. They hoped that this would convince the jury that the 41 axe hits did not prove that this wasn't self-defense. This form of evidence, however, could have been easily disputed by the prosecution because hypnosis isn't generally accepted as reliable evidence in court. The defense would also argue against showing pictures of Betty's body in order for the jury to see the brutality of the crime. They claimed that it would upset and anger the jury. The judge agreed to this and only let one photo of the body be shown. So, in the end, what was the outcome of this trial? Well, unfortunately, it's probably not what you were expecting. On October 29th, 1980, the jury of 9 women and 3 men found Candy Montgomery to be not guilty of both murder and manslaughter. So, where is Candy Montgomery now? What happened to her? Well, as the trial concluded, many members of her community heavily disagreed with this decision. As she left the courthouse, people would scream at her and yell murderer. She would leave her town and Texas as a whole and move to Georgia and become a family counselor. Some reports say that her and her husband, Pat, would get divorced a few years later, but I can't confirm that. Okay, so yeah, this story definitely just kind of sucks. Doesn't have a happy ending, I mean, like, I want this video to be just like facts and that, but just in my opinion, Candy just murdered Betty. It wasn't self-defense. Like, I do believe Betty probably attacked her, but 41 hits with an axe is not self-defense. Just in my non-lawyer, uh, dumb YouTuber opinion, but take that as you will. But yeah, anyways, even though the story sucks and the ending sucks even more, if you like this video and like the style of content, definitely check out my first video. It's not true crime related. It's on a cryptid, but I'll be making more of those videos. Speaking of which, next video on this channel will be another cryptid video, so keep a lookout for that. There will definitely be more true crime stuff. I just want to pick like a smaller, littler to try and practice doing this type of content more, because like I want to do true crime and stuff, but I want to make sure it's like respectful to the victims and all that. So yeah, hopefully this video is good. If you have any tips to make it better, leave it in the comments. And other than that, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.